The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution in early March requesting that Russia ceases its military actions in Ukraine. 141 member states voted in favor of the resolution, 5 against it, 35 abstentions, and 12 did not vote at all. Eritrea was one of 54 African countries who voted against the resolution. 16 African countries abstained, including South Africa, while 9 others did not vote at all. In total, approximately half of Africa's 54 member states elected to be neutral in some way. So, why didn't Africa vote overwhelmingly in favor of the resolution? Several African countries are thought to have decided to remain neutral and avoid condemning Russia for its invasion of Ukraine due to issues relating directly to the conflict as well as broader security, economic, and political concerns. There are 5 main reasons for this: skepticism about NATO and its motives, growing reliance on Moscow for military support among some countries in the last decade, growing reliance on wheat and fertilizer imports, and a sense that the Cold War is returning. African countries' decisions have been based on strategic calculations of how the conflict will affect them, rather than on the humanitarian disaster that has resulted from the conflict. In contrast, the European Union has been able to unite and take a unified stance on the conflict. For starters, some African countries, including South Africa, see NATO's eastward expansion as an aggressor. According to these countries, this poses a threat to Russia. South Africa's president recently blamed the organization for the conflict in Ukraine, stating, "The war could have been avoided if NATO had heeded the warnings from amongst its own leaders and officials over the years that its eastward expansion would lead to greater, not less, instability in the region." This is not the first time African countries have expressed reservations about NATO's activities. In 2012, the former president of Namibia, another country that did not vote, argued that NATO's overthrow of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi should be condemned and rejected by all Africans. The invasion of Libya and subsequent assassination of Gaddafi caused destabilization in North Africa and the Sahel region. As a result, NATO has become unpopular in a number of African countries. Second, several African countries, including Libya, Ethiopia, Mali, and Nigeria, have formed significant military alliances with Russia in the last decade. Several African countries have turned to Russia for help in combating insurgencies. This has ranged from hiring Russian private military contractors like the Wagner Group to direct arms imports. Because of Russia's lack of emphasis on human rights, many African countries have formed military alliances with it. For example, when the U.S. refused to sell certain weapons to Nigeria in 2014 due to gross human rights violations in the fight against Boko Haram, Nigeria turned to other countries for arms supplies, including Russia and Pakistan. Russia signed military cooperation treaties with Nigeria and Ethiopia, the 2 most populous African countries, in 2021. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Russia sold 18% of all weapons produced to Africa between 2016 and 2020. Some of these military alliances have existed since the Soviet era and are deeply ingrained. The third reason is that several African countries are dependent on Russia for wheat and fertilizers. This has resulted in stronger economic ties. Russia produces 16% of the world's wheat and 13% of the world's fertilizer. According to data from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, African countries imported wheat worth approximately $5.1 billion from Russia and Ukraine between 2018 and 2020. A quarter of African countries rely on the 2 countries for 1/3 of their wheat needs. African countries, already reeling from the impact of COVID-19, are skeptical about cutting any trade links. In addition, there is a perceived lack of support from the West during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has shifted many African countries further away from their traditional Western allies in Europe and America. The fourth reason is that some African countries see the conflict as a proxy war between the United States and Russia, reminiscent of the Cold War, and thus do not want to become involved. The Cold War caused untold hardship for several African countries, as it occurred at a time when most African countries were gaining independence and needed to align with one of the blocs. Several civil wars followed. As a result, it appears appropriate for some African countries to remain neutral at this time. Furthermore, China, a key ally of a number of African countries, has taken a similar stance. As a result, some of the country's African allies followed suit. Finally, in several African countries, there is a growing perception that traditional Western allies are only concerned with their own economies and people. They will only help if it is in their best interests or fits into the liberal agenda. For example, since the impact of Russian sanctions began to drive up commodity prices, the United States has turned to Venezuela, while the United Kingdom has turned to Saudi Arabia to increase oil production and reduce the burdens on citizens at home. There has been no mention of how African countries are affected or how to assist African countries with struggling economies. This brings back memories of the West's lackadaisical support during the pandemic. And it reinforces the need to remain neutral, or, in some cases, to refuse to be dictated to. Thanks for watching. If you like this type of content, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more stories.